Well, good morning. Welcome back again to another edition of our Anchored in the Word morning reflection. And I'd like to jump right into the text that we're going to be dealing with because this morning we have quite a bit to talk about. And so I'm not going to read the entire section of Scripture. I'm just going to read up to verse 28. But again, we're in Romans chapter 15, and we're reading verses 25 through 28 together, though we are looking at all the verses to 32 throughout this week. Here's what it says. But now I go into Jerusalem to minister unto the saints. For it hath pleased them of Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution to the poor saints which are at Jerusalem. It hath pleased them verily, and their debtors they are. For if the Gentiles had been made partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister unto them in carnal things. When therefore I have performed this, and have sealed to them this fruit, I will come by you unto Spain. Yesterday we looked at the simple fact that the gospel produces a culture that is merciful in the church. Well, this morning what we're going to look at is that the gospel cultivates not just a merciful culture, but a giving culture. And the last part of our lesson yesterday kind of really alluded to this, that they were not just giving their hearts where they were moved, but they were actually doing something about it. But Paul's going beyond just what the saints in Macedonia and Achaia have done. He wants the church at Rome to have the same kind of heart. And that is part of the reason that Paul brings it up. Part of it is he's telling them what he's been doing and why he's going to Jerusalem. But the other part is that he wants them to have the same kind of heart. And he wants us to have the same kind of heart as well. And so when the gospel is at the center of our heart, and it is really shaping what we think about in our lives and our values and our disposition, well, then the gospel is going to make us a giving people. And so he says it in verse 28. He says, I will come by you into Spain. His desire was that when he went to Spain, he would go having the financial gifts of this church being what took him there and was what partially supported him in his time there. And he understood there were no churches, and so he was going to have to do the work from scratch. So what we see here is that Paul had a need. And not only did Paul have a need, but the church itself had an opportunity. And so in verse 24 he says, when I take my journey to Spain, I will come to you, and I trust to see you in my journey, and be brought on my way thitherward by you, if first I be somewhat filled with your company. Paul needed support, and he wanted the church to have the opportunity to contribute toward the gospel spread to what was a previously untouched region. And whenever we have missionaries come into our church and they present their work, not only are they saying, I have a need, but they're also saying, you have an opportunity to participate in what we are ultimately going to do. When a missionary takes the gospel to a region that is untouched, or a region that needs churches to be reacclimated or stirred up or restarted, then what they're doing is not just saying, I need something, but you have an opportunity to actually get behind it. And I think it's important that I make this statement here. Paul wasn't an opportunist, and he most certainly wasn't lazy. Paul was an extremely diligent person. And in fact, the way that Paul provided for his physical needs it wasn't consistent in every single place. For instance, there were times that he worked night and day to support himself because that was really the only option that he had, or it was the best of the options that were available to him. And so he would work so that he could feed himself, and then he would labor in preaching the gospel. Paul was diligent, and he worked hard. And we see this in Acts chapter 18, verse 3, when he goes to Corinth. He goes to Corinth, and it says, because he was of the same craft, he abode with Aquila and Priscilla, and he worked. And their occupation was that they were tent makers. The way that Paul met Aquila and Priscilla at Corinth was that he didn't have a church that was taking care of him. He didn't have someone who was financially supporting him. He was working with his own hands. In fact, later on, when he actually has established a church in Corinth, and the church is a large church, it's a church that has most definitely the ability to take care of Paul, he chooses not to receive support from them. This is very, very unique. The church's view of ministry and how it was supported was wrong. It was twisted. It was misguided. And so rather than Paul allowing them to continue to have this view, he chose to not receive support from them because he wanted to teach them what principled giving and ministry and giving was supposed to look like. And so in 1 Corinthians 9:15, he says that the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. But I've used none of these things, neither have I written these things that it should be done unto me, for it were better for me to die than that a man should make my glorying void. He says, necessity is laid up of me, woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. So even though Paul had the right, and biblically the church was responsible to take care of Paul, because of their misunderstanding of what their giving would do to Paul's ministry, Paul chose to refrain from receiving that support in that situation. But then we see other examples where that's not what he did. For instance, there were times when he was supported like a pastor. 1 Corinthians 9:13, he says, do you not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple, and they which wait at the altars are partakers with the altar? Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. And so Paul was saying, as a general rule, in most places, those who minister in the word should be supported by those to whom they minister the word to. In the same way that the Levitical priests in the Old Testament were taken care of by the tithes and the offerings of the nation of Israel, in the same way, the church is supposed to provide for those who minister the gospel. But then he gives us another example where there were times where he was supported by churches that he had not previously started, and these people were basically like, it was like missionary support. And so in 2 Corinthians 11 verse 8, he says, I robbed other churches, taking wages of them to do you service. And when I was present with you, I was chargeable to no man, for that which was lacking to me of the brethren was given from Macedonia. In all these things I have kept myself from being burdensome to you, and so will I keep myself. A great example of this was when I was when I was a missionary in Ghana, and the church in Ghana did not financially support me as their pastor. The churches here in the United States who sent us, Anchor Baptist Church in Maryland, our church sent us, and other churches partnered with us, because that church was a very young church. It was not yet strong and fully developed. And so these churches supplied for our needs so that we could do the work and not put the burden on the church in Ghana. And so what Paul is basically saying is, when I say I have a need and you have an opportunity, I'm not doing this because I'm lazy. I'm doing this because, hey, ultimately churches need to get behind missionaries in these endeavors. So you might ask, well, Joel, why is missionary support really needed? Well, the reason that it's needed is it allows the church planter to devote all of his energy to the exclusive work of church planting. To put it simply, church planters will spend all their energy initially in getting the gospel out to people and meeting with as many people as possible, so that a place that has no believers, or there may be believers, you just don't know they're there, you have an opportunity to have a small group of believers that will ultimately become that local church as those believers mature and formally they unite themselves as a body of believers. Secondly, once the church is planted, once the church planter has seen that there is a group of believers, a small group, a nucleus of Christians, well, now his energy is going to be diverted into two streams. One is continuing to lead people to Christ, continuing to give the gospel, but also the work of making disciples, discipleship. And then it's going to even transition from that to being a more intensive discipleship, where believers are going to begin to mature and the church planter is going to begin transitioning into leadership development. The reason that I bring those things up is to simply say this. If someone is working full time to support their family, then that person is not going to have a lot of time to go out and give the gospel and make disciples and train that little nucleus of believers and ultimately raise up leadership and leadership development. Not saying it can't be done. There are places where that is the only option. And when that's the case, a person has to work very hard to do that work. And God in his grace does raise up churches in that way. But as a general rule, what is best for the church planter is to have the support they need so that all their attention can be given to the ministry of the word and evangelism, discipleship, and leadership training. In the same way that a pastor is going to be most effective if he's able to give of himself entirely to the work of ministry. So it allows churches to extend their ministry into cultures that they would never be able to effectively physically reach. And the third reason I'll mention is this: it keeps the heart of the church stirred up, their affections stirred up, their passion for the gospel. It focuses their heart on a desire to reach the nations. That's why having a giving culture is so important. But we need to not forget that the way that one has a giving culture is not by saying, let's go do it. It's by the gospel actually creating that in a healthy local church. I don't know about you, but that gives me, again, something to think about today. And I want to encourage you, pray for our church. Or maybe you're a member of another church of like faith. Pray for your church. Pray that your church will have an emphasis on the gospel so that it makes your church a place where it is a merciful culture and it is a giving culture where the needs of missionaries can be met with the opportunity and a willingness to partner. Hope that gives you a wonderful, wonderful thing to think about throughout the rest of your day and to pray about throughout the rest of the day. And Lord willing, tomorrow we'll meet again as we continue in our series through Romans 15, looking at how the gospel unites God's people. Have a blessed day. Bye now.